My E30 is many things. It's timeless, fun to drive, and pretty, at least to me. But given everything that it is, there is one thing that it most certainly is not. Fast. Or even quick, for that matter. Now, I don't want this car to be a race car, nor do I want it to be fast enough that I'm too scared to drive it every day. But that being said, I can't deny the fact that the car would be a lot more fun with a lot more power. And there's a number of ways we could get it. Those are big decisions though, and we don't need to make them right now. In fact, there's a couple easy things we can try as the car currently sits. So before we commit to anything too crazy, we might as well start there. Now sadly, finding more power in the E30 isn't nearly as simple as it is in the S4 or the TT. This car is naturally aspirated. NA cars take quite a bit more convincing than their turboed counterparts to make power. There's more we have to do. We still need to get a baseline, but since I don't have a dyno, the best way to get this baseline is to do before and after pulls. And believe it or not, the E30 is slow enough we can do this without speeding. Really funny. We can't accurately measure power without a dyno, but we can accurately see a change. If we do a pull from the same RPM in the same gear on the same road before and after any modification we do, we can see if it changed anything. And since power is going to be a long-term goal for this car going forward, I figured now was a fantastic time to get our baseline. For this baseline, I'm going to use second gear starting at about 2000 RPMs. And the intent is for each one of these pulls to be on the same road and take the car all the way to redline. That way, after we've done it as it sits now, whenever we make a modification in the future, we have something to compare it to. The car feels solid. It's not fast by any means, but it's engaging to drive. I think if we do want it to be a backroad sleeper, we will need to make it quite a bit faster though. When it comes to adding power to this car, the one thing it has going for it above all else is its weight. Since it's so light, a small increase in power is a big increase in how it feels. That being said, I don't really think I'm looking for just a small increase in power. This car has a fantastically capable chassis, so I'm a little bit on the fence. Half of me wants to keep the car somewhat tame, but the other half is interested in seeing what this car can actually do. Sure, we haven't decided what the long-term goal for this car is. Turbos, ITBs, stroker, I don't really know yet. But what I do know is we would be losing something jumping straight to a project that big. We would be fundamentally changing the car before really learning how the engine responds to power mods at all. So while we might boost this car in the future, there's a number of things I want to do on the stock engine first. In this box is an ECU-related modification. Online, some people praise it, and others say it does absolutely nothing. This is a performance chip. It's one of the most recommended mods for the engine that's in this car, and I've always wondered how much of a difference it actually makes. So I figured now is a great time to give it a try. And unlike my Audis, the ECU in this car is easily accessible in the glove box. Opening it up, it really only looks like we've got a couple screws in our way before we can pull it out. Well, I guess being able to get out of the car from the driver's seat does probably take priority. The last couple months, the interior door handle has been just a bit creaky. Something felt wrong. It felt fragile, less concrete than it always had. And recently I found out why. It completely broke. At this point, the handle does absolutely nothing. You're really just hoping you can pull on the cable. So probably a good time to remedy this. And thankfully, the same time we got the chip, I got the replacement for this. This fix will be fun because it'll be a lot of learning. I haven't had a reason to pull the door card on this car yet, so now will be a great time to try that out. And given how easy this car has been to work on so far, I'm sure it won't be too bad. And the irony is absolutely not lost on me that the last couple weeks, the E30 and the S4 have had very similar subject matter. They apparently like to brake in similar ways, so I guess you could say they're rivals. So before we tear it apart, what actually broke? In this case, it's actually fairly simple. The little backing plastic that holds the handle in place and allows it to rotate snapped. Likely this is just due to age, but it means the handle can't rotate. So we need to pull the door card and swap it out. Firstly, by twisting off the lock knob and then removing the power mirror control. And so far, this car is being true to its reputation of being easy to work on. The entire door card seems to be removable with just your hands and a screwdriver. Three screws later, the entire thing can be popped off. It's mostly just held on with clips, meaning there is no extra hardware for us to keep track of. And while I was in here, I noticed just how beefy this window's regulator is. If you can even call it a regulator. It's just gears. With the door card pulled, however, we can get a much better look at what broke in the handle. Really, just the top part of the backing portion, which completed the fulcrum, allowing it to rotate. I also took this time to get to know the rest of this door. I want to know how the whole system works on the off chance we run into any issues in the future. My thought with life has always been that a little learning now goes a long way in the future. So it's usually worth your time. Now, actually replacing this latch is pretty simple. It's only got 3 connections: the cable on the back and the 2 screws on the front. Those are what we need to remove first. And after that, I messed around with the whole thing a bit in order to figure out how to remove the cable on the back. If it was all one piece still, it would have been quite a bit easier to remove. But since it wasn't, I just took it apart inside the door. Putting the new piece on is quite a bit easier now that we can actually see what the cable looks like. It is a 180-degree hook, meaning the handle needs to go on vertically, and then we can just rotate it 90 degrees to be in the right orientation. And once it's in the right place, all we have to do is reinstall the screws, followed by the rest of the door card. It's honestly one of the simplest door latch designs I've seen. Honestly, I'm pretty thrilled that the E30 door handle is working now. It was getting a little frustrating to pull on it and snap it more every single time trying to get out of the car. So I'm glad we got around to doing this.
With that out of the way, we can jump back into the chip. There's a number of different brands you can go with when it comes to chip tuning, and just like I'll recommend for anything software related, you definitely get what you pay for. You should always go with a company who knows what they're doing, and in this case, I went with Turner Motorsports. This is one of the most recommended options that there is.
If you've been working on cars for a while, you've probably heard of the term of chip tuning. Nowadays, it's less so chip tuning, more so you just reprogram the ECU itself. So back in the day, with a car like the E30, rather than plugging into the car via OBD2 and rewriting the ECU like we've been doing on the S4 and the TT, you pull the ECU, take it apart, and you change a physical chip on it to allow for more performance. And this is effectively how you would tune a car with that sort of an ECU. You can chip it. And that's where that term comes from.
And with that in mind, the first step is to actually take the ECU out of the car. This one is located behind 2 screws and a little cover. And once we're back there, 4 bolts and the electric harness is all that keeps this thing in place. Coming from the TT, where the first time I had to pull the ECU, I had to use a Dremel to cut a cage around it, this is a breath of fresh air. If you're looking for a project that's going to fight you every step of the way, I don't think you could say the E30 is your best candidate. From what I can tell, this thing was designed to be worked on. One thing to note is that the chip does not know what ECU it's going on, but each chip is written for a specific ECU part number, so you need to make sure that they match, and in my case, they do. So we can pull the tabs on the back and start getting the ECU cover off. With each of the tabs bent up, I flipped it over and I pulled the cover off. This is what the brain of my E30 looks like. Just your typical ECU. There's a number of different components on this board, but the one we specifically care about is the chip that we are replacing. And that would be the one with this white plastic cover up on top. This cover only works with the stock chip, so we can tell this car hasn't been chip tuned already, and using a pocket screwdriver we can pull it up. The big thing when working on a board like this is to just be delicate. All the pins and connections are small, so they're fragile. When you apply pressure, you want to make sure you apply it equally, some on one side and some on the other. If you look closely, you'll also notice that one side of this chip has a little divot. We need to remember what side that was on, so that we can put the new chip on in the same way. It also has a corresponding divot. And that is really the biggest thing you need to worry about with this entire process. Other than that, it is a direct swap. And as the new chip went in, one thing I was specifically looking out for was that before I put any pressure on pushing it in, I made sure all the holes were lined up correctly. Fixing a bent chip is a lot worse than taking a little extra time to make sure it's lined up correctly. With the chip properly in place, however, we can button the ECU back up and get it back in the car. Just like any time I tune a new car, I was a little bit nervous. This was the first time I'd ever chip-tuned a car. So while the fear was irrational, I was worried the car wasn't going to start, or something was going to go terribly, terribly wrong. I also figured that it would be a good idea to keep the OEM tune chip. That way we'll have a complete M20 ECU going forward no matter which route we end up with. Both ITBs and forced induction would need a standalone anyways. So we'll see what happens there. With everything out of the way, all that was left to do was hop in the car and see if it fires up. After all, we still don't really know if this chip made any difference at all. The car fired up just like normal. No weird noises, no RPM hunting, no lights on the dash. So far, so good. The only way we can really tell if there's a difference though is taking it for a drive. Before we get too far into testing this chip, I've had a number of things on my mind as of late. This week specifically, I've been thinking a lot about the long-term goals I have for this car.
Doing this sort of a modification really just made me think more about what we can do to it in the future. Should we keep the car naturally aspirated going forward, or should we learn to boost it? Originally, I did buy this car with the plan to boost it, but I have been enjoying it naturally aspirated. We might lose some sort of responsiveness, but I think we would learn a lot from building the turbo kit.
As opposed to the simple build of keeping it NA. We could go with ITBs, headers, and a standalone, and it would probably be pretty fun. The turbo, on the other hand, has been something I've wanted to do to a naturally aspirated car ever since I was little. It's a bucket list item for me.
Turbos and ITBs both sound really cool. They sound very different, but they're cool enough in my opinion that I think they'd sound pretty equivalent. Different, but equivalent in my mind. Power per dollar, however, the turbo absolutely wins. Believe it or not, an ITB setup on this engine would be a lot more expensive and actually get us a couple hundred less wheel horsepower. We'd end up around 200 wheel horsepower at full tilt all motor with this engine, unless we went with something like a stroker. But if we kept the stock M20 B25, we'd be at about 200 wheel. That's what the spec E30 cars run with ITBs and a very aggressive tune, and that's about as far as we'd push it naturally aspirated. That'd be a lot of fun, but it's not gonna feel super, super fast in a straight line. Turbo, on the other hand, we'd be looking at a couple more hundred wheel horsepower. It's pretty easy to make mid 300 to low 400 wheel horsepower on this engine pretty much stock. They respond to boost incredibly well, and there's a lot of room in the engine bay to actually build the kit. So it would honestly be a lot easier than the TT. Either way, I don't think we can go wrong, but I do want to hear what you would suggest for this car. I think a turbo could be a lot of fun, but I also think naturally aspirated could be fun too. Really just depends what we want to go for with the car. But do keep in mind that my original purchase intent with this car was to boost it, because it's always been on my bucket list to turbo a naturally aspirated car. I think that'd be a really cool accomplishment, but I'm also not fully sold on it. We can always buy another naturally aspirated project to boost in the future, and we likely will.
At this point, this week, I only have one question left. Did this chip add performance to the car, fundamentally changing how it feels and making it better? Or can I hardly tell? There's only one way to really find out. Get in, go to the same road, and do the same test we did earlier. First things first, we've got to touch on the magnitude of this change. It's not like tuning a turbo car. We're not going to pick up 80 horsepower. All the chip claims is an additional 10 to 15. So, that being said, do I notice a difference?
And if I'm being honest, the car does feel more responsive. It's clearly dumping more fuel into the system, and with our exhaust and high flow intake, it's likely actually making a bit more power.
Is it enough to really make a difference in acceleration though? If I'm being honest, not super noticeably. This is the old one, and it's only marginally slower. Looking back at these, I can't really see a huge difference. I think the chip's slightly faster, but it's really close.
Is it super noticeable though? When compared to tuning the TT or the S4, absolutely not. Max, we're talking maybe 10 horsepower, 15 if we're lucky, and the torque is roughly equivalent. Versus on the TT, we'd pick up 50 or 60 foot-pounds of torque immediately. So, very different ballgame, but I think it is a step in the right direction. Is it enough for me to be satisfied with the power the car has though? I don't really think so.
That being said, I'm still definitely happy we did this mod. While it may not be a ton faster, it feels a little punchier, more direct, and that's honestly all I was hoping for from it. So I'm happy we got around to testing it, and I'm excited for what I have planned next. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider dropping a like and subscribing for more. That's the best way you can help support me and my content. Either way, I'll see you guys in the next episode. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day.